3, 2, 1.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar. I'm Ed, the technical person here. Just say a few things first about using this webinar software. By default we can't hear you because otherwise we'd hear 20 odd people heavy breathing at once. We can unmute you as and when, so if there's a little hand button by the software, if you click that, we'll see that you've got your virtual hand up. If you would like to send in questions during the session, please do that via the little chat window, and then we'll come to them at the end. If there are burning issues that you've got, please put your hand up and we'll come to you. Otherwise, after each presentation, we'll open it up for a Q&A session, and then if you put your hands up, we'll come to you in turn. We are recording this. If anyone has any objections to that, please get in touch. But otherwise, we will circulate a link to people afterwards, and a few people have asked that they get that anyway, which is fine. We'll do that. I think that's it. Technical problems, please email me or message me during the session. Otherwise, I'll now hand over to Anne-Marie Towers, who's going to make the first presentation.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Ed. Welcome, everyone. This is the first time that we've done one of these ASCOT webinars. So it'll be interesting to get your feedback at the end and see how it goes. So I'm just going to do a very short introduction before I hand over to our speakers, just to give you all an idea of recent developments with ASCOT since our annual workshop last year. Okay, so since the last workshop last year, we've had more registered ASCOT users. We're now well over the 1,000 registered users mark. We've run 2 of the one-day ASCOT courses, which give you a general overview of ASCOT and the different types of measures and help people understand the different domains. We've run one CH3 course, which is the care homes course, the 2-day one, and we have another one coming up. Quick plug for that in June. Those 2-day courses are always held here at Kent, and we currently do have spaces. I'm looking at colleagues nodding. So if you would be interested in finding out more about that at the end of the webinar, please email us and we can sign you up for that. We've also had invitations over the last year to talk about ASCOT at various international conferences and seminars. So that's here in the UK, where we've held international conferences in London, but also we've gone to places like Finland or even Australia. So ASCOT really has generated a lot of interest around the world, and that's increasing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We've had more requests for bespoke training from local authorities across England and Wales, and also, interestingly, more interest from provider organisations, which is really promising. We've had more providers attending the one-day training, and we're currently in negotiations with providers to potentially provide more training to their management teams, and that's in the UK and Australia. So all this demand has led to an increase in the amount of training that we're needing to provide, sort of more bespoke training, and this goes back to any of you that have had a relationship with us for some time will know that we've been talking about moving towards a train the trainers approach. This is still something that we would really like to do, so the desire is there, but an ongoing problem that we're having is the ability to create a course that contains video clips that people can practice on. To enable us to do that, we need to be able to have the right consents and permissions from service users and their families. So if there's any providers listening that want to help us with that, please do contact us afterwards. Until we get those clips with the necessary permissions, we can't really progress the train the trainers material. So the desire is there, but it's on hold. In terms of workshops, we were really interested to this year to find that we didn't get a lot of sign-up when we proposed to hold the workshop in London, and we're not quite sure why that was. So we've offered these webinars as an alternative, and actually there's been a lot of interest in these webinars. So perhaps that's something I can open up to all of you listening to come back to us on at the end and tell us, is it something that you're interested in, webinars in the future? Do you have any idea why the workshops weren't signed up to that well this year? Because in the past they've been very well attended. So some sort of insight into that would be really helpful. And along those lines, we're working really hard now to find better ways of measuring the outcomes of hard-to-reach groups. So this is all things that have been going on over the last year. And James and Nick are going to be talking about that in more detail in a moment. And finally, the other thing that we've been doing over the last 12 months is that we've been developing new toolkits. So the first one that I'm going to mention briefly is that we now have an ASCOT measure specifically to measure the outcomes of carers. And this was developed as part of the IASC study, and it can be used alongside the other ASCOT measures, and it's going to be available on our website very soon. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this now, because if you sign up to our next webinar on the 15th of June, then you will be able to hear Stacey, who was one of the main authors of the new carer measure, talk about that in a lot more detail. So if that's something you think you might be interested in, please do sign up for our next webinar. The other bit of work that we've been doing, and again, I'm going to talk about this in more detail on the 15th of June, is that we've developed, we've adapted really the care homes measure for use at the home level, and by that I mean so that you measure the outcomes at the home level instead of the individual level. So it can be used in things like quality monitoring, for example, and improvement by local authorities. Some of you may already know about the feasibilities pilot study that we did last year with SSCR. And the outcome of that project really was that people were interested in this, particularly local authorities. And we're going to be piloting it more widely with East Sussex over the next year or two as part of a new SSCR funded study. So I will talk about that in more detail on the 15th of June if anyone's interested in finding out more. So with all this work that's been going on, we've had to expand the ASCOT team. I thought this might be a nice opportunity to introduce us all to you. So there's some of us that have been here for a while that you would already know, especially if you've come along to previous workshops and trainings. So that's Juliet, Nick and I in particular. And obviously she's still on here because although she's retired, she still leads on the international development side of the work. We've got Camilla, who I think a lot of you will know because you would have been liaising with if you've been attending the webinars and workshops and training in the past. We've also got Stacey, who will be presenting at the next webinar, and Stacey is taking the lead on the carers work, but she's also involved in some of the other engagement work such as proxy work. And Stacey's done a lot of work around the interview versions of ASCOT, so she's going to be a lead person to if you have any questions around that. And James, who will be speaking in a moment, who's leading on the work developing the Easy Read measure and the proxy. And Ed, who introduced us just now, he's the technical lead, and he's also working with a new member of staff called Alan Duggan, who is here today and tweeting in the background. And so Alan, when he has a photo, he's very, very new, so when he has a photo, he will soon be up there as well. So just to give you all an idea of how the team's grown really in response to demand. So that's the kind of development side of it, but we thought it might be quite interesting to flag how ASCOT's being used outside of our organisation. Most recently it's been used by the Older People's Commission for Wales, which I thought was quite interesting, and I've sent you a link there. You can click on that link and it will take you to a summary of their review of care homes. So they received training and they sent volunteers into care homes as part of that bit of work to measure outcomes for residents, and it fed into their report. It's also been recommended by SCI, the Social Care Institute of Excellence here in England, as a tool to measure risks and outcomes of service users. And very recently we've had a care provider, Positive Futures, use ASCOT in their evaluation of their own users, and that's focusing on younger adults with intellectual disabilities. And there's a link there to their blog, which is really interesting, and I recommend you read it if that's something that you'd be interested in as a provider. So I mentioned that Anne is still very much involved in the international side of the work. Talking around that, we've now got an international network and committee, and I think some of our listeners today are part of that. And we're trying the idea of this international committee is that it's going to provide more systematic support for translations and applications across the globe. We've already got translations in Finnish, German, Italian, Danish, Dutch, Japanese and Thai. And we've had inquiries from Spain and China. I'm not sure if anyone can add to that, if we had any more recent translations. I think that's it. We've had, because of the huge international interest in translating, we've been working with a translation company who specialise in patient-reported outcome measures such as ASCOT. And they have worked with us to develop what you call concept elaboration documents, which means that every single ASCOT instrument will have a concept elaboration which talks you through the different wording, the different terminologies, which will help enormously with any future translations. And they will, alongside that, there will be guidance about the process that which you should follow if you want to translate it in an official capacity. So there's a lot of work been going on around that. Alongside the translation, of course, is how it's been used in application, so in terms of international projects. So Anne's been involved in a project with Macquarie University and the University of Wollongong in Australia, and they've got a grant to develop measures to understand outcomes in the community for their older people's services, and that's really interesting. That's not that recently started, roughly the last 6 to 12 months. That project's really kicked off. I think you can probably Google that if you want to find out more. It's called the Community Care Outcomes Project, and Macquarie University have a page dedicated to that project. Exploring, now this is a long one, exploring comparative effectiveness and efficiency in long-term care. This is the Excel project, as it's now called. It's funded by Norface, and it involves 3 countries, Finland, Austria and England. And one of the main advantages to this project is that it's going to be an opportunity to develop preference weights, similar to the ones that we have in the UK, but for in-country preference weights, so for Finland and Austria. And this actually, although that's a standalone project, we're making links to the next project that's on the slide, which is measuring and valuing quality of life in older adults. And this is the project that's being undertaken in the Netherlands, funded by the Netherlands Organisation for Scientific Research. And that study, although it's separate from the Excel study, funded separately, we will be making those links because as part of that project they will also be collecting Dutch preference weights, and they're doing some philosophical adaptations as well, so that make sure that domains and the wording work well for that cultural background. So there's really some really nice opportunities here, and hopefully at the end of it we will have official ASCOT versions in those languages with the corresponding in-country preference weights. So really, really good news for ASCOT, and good news for anyone wanting to use ASCOT in those countries for economic evaluation or research. So I think I've probably taken up enough time in terms of the introductory presentation. So thank you for listening. Obviously you all have our details, but that's just a little reminder. And just to say that all the work here is funded by Quoro that goes into ASCOT, and that this is the views of us and not the Department of Health. If you have any questions now, then I think Ed can help us take them. Otherwise, I'll just hand straight over to James, who's going to talk to us about the easy read version of ASCOT. No? No burning questions? Okay, I'm going to hand over to James then.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anne-Marie, and good morning, everyone. So, yes, I'm going to talk about promoting participation of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in social care research, with specific reference to the work that we've been doing around developing an easy-read version of ASCOT. First, I'll just give you a little bit of background to Quoro, which is the Quality and Outcomes of Person-Centred Care Research Unit, and the engagement strand that kind of sits within that, as it were. So QUORU is a collaboration involving researchers in health and social care from Universities of Kent, Oxford and the London School of Economics. It's funded by the Department of Health to support current government policy in health and social care on achieving outcomes. And it contains a number of other programs designed with specific aims in mind, and these are the application strand, which is about understanding how information about care-related needs and quality of life can be used to sort of optimally achieve those person-centered goals for things like commissioning and regulation and so on and so forth. The measurement strand, which is about finding ways to identify the best measure or identify and best measure the needs, quality of life, well-being and health of people in a way that's relevant to the way that they experience services and support that they access. The service delivery strand, which is about developing an evidence base on which specific interventions succeed in delivering those person-centered outcomes. And then, of course, there's the engagement strand, which I predominantly work on, which is about developing methods to improve the participation of hard-to-engage people in research, so that their experiences can be best reflected in the evidence base. So measurement is a core government mechanism to manage accountability, but if this measurement is to be rigorous, valid and unbiased, it has to include the voices of those populations or individuals that are either reluctant to take part, hard to include, or seldom heard. And this is the real aim of the engagement programme. So as the name suggests, it's to try and engage with those groups and individuals which are otherwise unheard, and they're probably among some of the most important groups because they're often very high users. So, for example, they might have quite high levels of dependency, and among those kind of biggest users of social care services, and consequently, kind of those perhaps higher cost services as well. So I'm sure lots of you are very aware of the work that we do here at PSSIU, which is about the impact of social care on people's lives, how it can be best provided, and also how it can be funded properly. And one of the ways we look at the impact of social care is by looking at the answers people give to a survey called the Adult Social Care Survey. This is an annual survey of about 1,000 people who receive social care services in each local authority. There's about 150,000 people in total. As well as questions about service use and satisfaction, it also includes the ASCOT questions so that we can calculate social care-related quality of life. However, obviously not everybody can answer for themselves, even when they do have some support. And so this can lead to things like non-response, missing data, and invalid data. And so, again, you can just see some examples here on the slide in terms of how many people who completed the Adult Social Care Survey had a learning disability, and how many of those people also reported having at least some form of help to help them to complete the questionnaire. So, and there are a range of kind of associated problems with any long-term condition that can make it more difficult for people to take part in research. So things like sensory, cognitive, behavioural, communication, psychosocial and emotional impairments can obviously make it difficult for people to participate in research. Also, the structured format of surveys, for example, that can be quite challenging for people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities. And again, this can lead to some exclusion or low levels of engagement in the measurement of the care experience and outcomes for specific groups of people. And also for certain individuals, this exclusion can be intensified if, for example, they happen to be part of certain population groups such as black and minority ethnic communities, traveller communities, recent and older refugees, those with lower levels of income and education, and those who don't necessarily, or they don't meet the necessary eligibility criteria for the statutory provision of care interventions, so those self-funders. So with that in mind, one of the aims of the engagement programme is to develop modified tools and versions of ASCOT that can be used to capture information where the standard tool is perhaps not appropriate. And hopefully these can be used in a sort of tailored way for individuals. So as part of what we are developing in the work that we're doing at the moment and have been doing is obviously the easy read version. So that's the version that people can complete by themselves or again with some support, and that's what I'm going to predominantly talk about this morning. We have a proxy version in development. Obviously the most informed person or people to tell us about the services that they're actually accessing and how those services meet their needs is the service users themselves. But where this is not always possible due to, for example, profound cognitive impairment, rather than sort of have no data related to these individuals, then the next best thing is to sort of ask someone that knows them well, knows about the care that they receive, they know about the services that they use, and so this could be for an informal carer or a paid carer to complete on somebody else's behalf. The semi-structured interview version, which again is for people that might struggle with that structured approach of a questionnaire, but can also or can nonetheless kind of comment on their views about sort of the different areas of quality of life and specifically the domains which are obviously included in the ASCOT measure. And then there's what we call a mixed method approach, which is going to be developed from the residential care tool, and this is initially just looking at the feasibility of using this approach in a community setting, so using things like observation in combination with user and carer interviews. So that's just kind of a broad overview of some of the different versions that we're developing at the moment. So let's talk about the Easy Read tool itself. Although there was an Easy Read version of ASCOT that was developed, this was undertaken under fairly tight time pressures, and the general feedback that we received from user groups suggested that it could benefit some revision. So this was the aim of this particular project, to revise and update what we call the ER version, the Easy Read version. And to start this off, we just looked at really kind of best practice for Easy Read documents and information. And some of this is pretty common sense stuff, really. So obviously Easy Read should contain or use things like plain language, have a simple layout and format, use images to illustrate specific key messages in the text, and also Easy Read is sometimes referred as easy words and pictures, easy information, or easy to read type documents. So just to talk you through the methods and the process which we went through, which obviously started with gaining ethical approval from the Social Care Research Ethics Committee and Research Governance where that was appropriate. We set up a working group, and the purpose of that was to assist the research team and very much guide the development of the measure at every single main stage. So for this we included 5 people with either an intellectual disability or autism who were recruited to be part of this working group, which worked with us throughout the whole process. And after the first revision that we did in collaboration with the working group, this was then tested in 8 focus groups with a total of 32 participants. And this was followed by more input from the working group after some discussion of those focus groups and the experience of those, and followed by another wave of testing, but this time conducting some one-to-one cognitive interviews, again with people with learning disabilities or autism. And finally we had some further meetings and got input again from the working group before making any final revisions to the tool. I should also say that we worked with an organisation called Change, who are a leading human rights organisation that specialise in developing accessible material, and they were involved in creating the new images that you'll see and that we used in the new version. Okay, so just was going to tell you one small part about some of the method that we used, and that was this what we called the staggered reveal method, which we used in both working group sessions and also focus groups. And what we did here was initially to show participants just the illustration on its own, so some of the pictures that we were testing to accompany the question, and then we'd ask people what they thought the question would be about, what their interpretation of the image was, what they thought the images were showing. Then that would be followed by we'd show people the question stem, which is just the sort of first part of the question really, and then we talk about and discuss the question that was being asked, the words that were being used, and ask people how they thought they would answer the question in their own words. And then finally we would reveal the sort of the full question, including response options, corresponding images, so that's the smiley faces or sad faces, and then the wording and words used in each of the response options were then discussed along with the images for those. And this was quite useful for doing things like comparing people's own responses with the question responses and interpretations of images in terms of what they were intended at least to depict for the respondents themselves. Okay, so in terms of analysis, we had five focus groups and 21 cognitive interviews which were audio recorded, and in the remaining focus groups and interviews we just had detailed notes. Where recordings weren't made, that was essentially because people or someone in the focus group, and it only had to be one individual, if any person either objected or simply appeared to be a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of recording, then in those cases this wasn't done, and so we took detailed notes. The focus group recordings were not transcribed verbatim, but again we took detailed notes from these, and whereas the cognitive interviews were transcribed and then transferred to NVivo for analysis. We did do the questionnaire data from the cognitive interviews was collected and analysed using some descriptive statistics, but of course we had an extremely small sample, so here any analysis was really very limited, so we weren't able to do a huge amount with that. Okay, so hopefully onto the slightly more interesting stuff. In terms of what we found and some of the changes that we made as a result of some of those findings. And obviously the images can add a lot and greatly enhance the understanding for people, particularly with more abstract concepts such as dignity or the safety domain. Firstly, the colour images were replaced with black and white, and this was something that Change advised on, but also has some other benefits, such as reducing the cost of producing ER materials. We went through various iterations of pictures. Some were discarded completely because they were too complex, or they weren't tapping into the underlying concept of the domain properly, or the way that we had intended, while others we were sort of amended and sort of fine-tuned until we reached a final consensus for the final version. And here we found that pictures, obviously with a clear relevance to people's own experiences, seem to work much better. Another thing that we found was if we tried to include too much detail, and particularly multiple level images, so this is things like thought bubbles within thought bubbles, this was quite confusing, particularly for people with autism. And I'll show you an example here of what I mean. So you should see this was one of the original images that we looked at working with, and so you can see this sort of central character who's a wheelchair user thinking about the various choices that he might make in relation to his home, what food to eat, what clothes to wear, but it was actually quite problematic, particularly within the bubbles within bubbles, which I'll just highlight here. So you can see particularly the top one, it's actually quite difficult to see what's going on there, to see that there's a bed and that somebody might be considering something about their housing arrangement. So that was something that we found was a bit sort of too detailed, and so this particular image was amended as part of the process. But it's just a good example to show you some of the things that we found and then went on to do as a result of some of those findings. Okay, so I haven't got time, obviously, to take you through each domain and the various iterations, but I wanted to show you some examples. And you can have a look at the full report, which I'll point you to later, to look at all of the domain questions individually and how they kind of evolved, as it were. But this original image is for the food and drink domain. And so some of the problems that we had reported for this particular domain were, firstly, it was unclear as to whether the woman and the food are part of the same picture, so people were not quite sure whether she was looking at the food because she's hungry or whether they were two separate images. Also, you can see that she's holding a mug of either tea or coffee, but one of the problems that we found with that was that people would then think exclusively about whether they have enough tea or coffee and not necessarily think about other drinks that you might consume. And also, if you look at the actual food itself, you can see some of the images. So you've got a picture of a chicken and a picture of a carrot, but the chicken doesn't really look like chicken at all. The carrots don't really look like carrots. I don't think I would eat carrots that look like that. And again, some of the images behind that, it's obscured by the sign. You can see some sandwiches behind, but again, it was not necessarily clear as to what that was. So here you'll see the revised image, and this contains different types of drinks. So again, you've still got kind of tea, coffee, but orange juice, water. It also includes meals from different times of day, so breakfast through to lunch and dinner, so to help people think about kind of all the separate meals that they would have throughout the day when they're thinking about how to answer the question. So this is another example. So the pictures that you can see here are for the original safety domain question, although it's not necessarily strictly clear that from the images alone that the question would necessarily be about safety. And some of the responses that we got to this were that the question might be about mental health, or feeling happy, feeling sad, feeling anxious about something. And this is probably a good point to talk about one of the major changes that we made to the ASCOT questionnaire for the ER version, and that is namely to split the safety domain into two separate questions. So for those of you that are familiar with ASCOT and the safety question will know that it asks you to essentially simultaneously think about how safe you feel both inside and outside the home, and then essentially aggregate the two in your response. But this is quite cognitively demanding and proved to be very problematic for people with learning disabilities or autism. And also for many people, their answer would vary quite widely depending on whether they were thinking about whether they were inside their home or outside in their local community. And so that made it quite difficult for people. So what I'll show you now, so that the images that you can see here are actually depicting safety outside of the home. So this is in your local area. And this was particularly something that was of concern to the participants that took part in the study, as well as the people in our working group. So here you can see somebody having their bag snatched or being robbed, and then another image of sort of antisocial type behaviour, which again was very much reported as a big concern for some of our participants. So just a couple of examples there where you can see some of the images changing and being amended. So also, of course, we've got images for the response, for the 4 response options. So again, on the left, you can see the original images that were used. And we found, again, that there was a few issues with these. Firstly, there's quite a lot going on in that you've got sort of happy and sad faces, but also thumbs up and thumbs down, ticks and crosses. And so you can kind of see the logic in providing as much information as possible to help people choose the right response for them, but we found that most people found this a bit too much, and it created some confusion, partially because there's too much information being given, but also things like the ticks and crosses were confusing for some people who thought that it might mean you have to put ticks here and a cross here, or that where there were crosses that people shouldn't answer that response because that was wrong, and so there was quite a few things going on that were making it difficult for people. There's also some issues with the levels, the differences between levels, and while these can sometimes be relatively subtle, and they are quite difficult to illustrate, there is a slight mismatch in the 3rd level. So you can see here, the 3rd level, which I'll just highlight, is quite a neutral face, and it would seem to kind of better fit with a 3 or 5 point Likert scale, but it's actually level 3 on the ASCOT scale, and this was a bit confusing for some participants who thought this could and should represent a situation which was okay or about right, as opposed to one which is perhaps less than okay on the ASCOT scale. So, so I'll show you the revised version. So you can see, obviously they're black and white, and they're much simpler. There's no ticks and crosses. There's no neutral face, you'll notice. And in testing, these images, we found that they worked quite a lot better. You'll also notice that the bottom sort of sad face has a little teardrop on that particular image, and we in the research team were unsure about whether this would work actually, but it was something that came out of some of the early testing that we did. But when we changed it and went out and retested it, we found that it helped people distinguish between the bottom two levels. So that was something that people reported being particularly helpful. So moving on to wording and structure of the questions, again we follow general guidance on easy read information in using very short sentences, using an active voice rather than passive, so that's where the subject performs the action that's stated, using bullet points, although we did avoid some numbered lists, and also using simple words, or where this was completely unavoidable, explaining or defining difficult words that have been identified. So the question stems were actually longer than in the standard questionnaires, and also in the answers as well. But longer answers seem to work much better than simple sort of 1 or 2 word phrases that you might see in Likert scales. And this was partly because people found it. They found that more information was better, as it were, rather than having kind of something that they needed to comment on. Where they had relatively little information. I'll show you an example of this. So on the left, you can see the original text for the dignity domain, and I'm not going to read through it all now, but you can just see the slightly longer question stem on the right-hand side, but with short sentences, and while the response options are slightly shorter, you can see that they still provide more information than a scale ranging from sort of very bad to very good, as it were. So again, that's just kind of another example to show you. And here's another one, again, just looking at specifically some of the text. This is the kind of clean and comfortable domain. And again, I'm not going to read it out, but if you have a look at some of the text on the left-hand side, which I've highlighted there, so it's kind of a little bit clunky. The revised version breaks this down a little bit more. It also defines what it means by being presentable, as this was specifically identified as potentially one of the more problematic words. But interestingly enough, I think almost all of the participants actually understood what it meant to be presentable, but identified being presentable as a difficult concept for others. So where they reported that they were happy with it and understood it, it was a word that was highlighted as potentially problematic. It's possibly because it's quite a long word, because it's multisyllabic, but it was something that was specifically identified. So here we kind of define it explicitly. Okay, so we've looked at some of the constituent parts of the questions, but I just thought it might be useful to show you a kind of an entire version, as it were, for one of the domain questions. This is for the personal cleanliness and comfort domain. So you can see the old version on the left and the revised version on the right, and it uses some of the changes that I've spoken about. And so you can see some of the images have changed to depict kind of all stages of being clean and comfortable, from having a shower to being supported to get ready, and then finally being dressed and feeling presentable. Again, there's slightly more information, but shorter sentences being used, and then there's the change to the new sort of simpler, happy, sad faces for some of the response options. You'll see all these in the full report, but I just thought it might be useful just to show you a kind of full version as opposed to kind of breaking it down as have been so far. So, of course, this study was not without limitations, and so here, while we did collect some demographics and other information from participants, we weren't able to collect any information on people's expressive and receptive language abilities. We had an extremely small sample, of course, but this was a developmental study, so if we were kind of making or looking at testing things like constructability, then obviously we would look to work with a much larger sample. And the other thing was not all of the participants were actually using social care services. This was actually only 2, but they were kept in the study because they were obviously still able to kind of gauge and interpret some of the questions, and it only became apparent that they were not specifically using social care services at the point that they were about to take part. So we felt that it would be unethical to exclude them at that point, particularly as they were enthusiastic and wanted to be part of the study. So they were included. Okay, so that's coming to the end now. So just for some more information, you can go to the Quarry website. You can see that you can download the full report. So that contains all the various iterations of the questions, how they evolved, and perhaps some of the nuances that I wasn't able to cover this morning in the presentation. There's also some more information about the work done at PSSRU more generally. You can follow us on Twitter. There's my email address as well, just in case you wanted to contact me directly about anything about the work that we've done. So please do that. So I think that's it. Thanks for listening. I think there might be some time for some questions, if anybody has any, before we move on to the next presentation, which will be by Nick Smith.
If there are questions, if you raise your virtual hand, I'll unmute you, but it doesn't look like there are.
Okay, great. But as I said, if there's further questions, once people have perhaps had a chance to look at the report and they want to come back to me, then please do that.
One question someone did ask is, will the slides be made available afterwards? And assuming the authors have no problems with that, and they're all nodding, yes, they will. They'll go up on the ASCOT website later today, quickly.
Okay,
over to Nick.
Great, thank you.
Morning, everyone. It's very strange not seeing people's faces, but I'll do my best to hammer through this presentation. So what I want to talk about today is our thinking, mine and Anne-Marie's thinking about using ASCOT for people with dementia, and some of the tools which have either been developed or are in the process of being developed. So just a bit of background, thinking about the prevalence of dementia in the UK, current estimates suggest that in the UK there are currently about 850,000 people living with dementia, and that number is forecast to rise by about 40% by 2025 and 157% by 2051. But currently the estimates say about 1.3% of the population live with dementia. But the prevalence of dementia varies quite a lot across age groups, and there is an association with age, with older age. So while at between 65 and 79, there's only 1.7% of the population living with dementia. It goes up progressively as you get older, and as you see, when you get to be over 95, it's about 40% of the population live with dementia. So still, at no age group is it the dominant characteristic. But if we think about social care, we can see the importance of thinking about dementia in terms of measuring outcomes in social care. So it's estimated that about 70% of care home residents live with dementia. And also, if you're thinking about home care, the UK Home Care Association estimates that around 60% of people receiving home care are living with dementia. And again, if we look at the cost of dementia, we see how important thinking about dementia is to thinking about outcomes in social care. So the cost of dementia is estimated to be 10.3 billion for social care if you include both public spending and private spending. This compares with 4.3 billion for healthcare, and 1.6 billion is estimated to be the cost of the unpaid care that people with dementia receive. And when we're thinking about including people with dementia, people living with dementia in our evaluations, our research, it's quite important to think about the characteristics of dementia and why it might be challenging. So dementia itself is not an illness but a syndrome. It's a group of concurrent symptoms caused by a number of different illnesses. So if you think there's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, vascular dementia, CJD, there's a number of different diseases that feed into this overall group of dementia. But dementia affects people in different ways, and one of the ways you can think about that is Tom Kitwood's idea of personhood, and thinking about that the way someone is, someone's personhood is it's not just about their dementia. It includes their neurological impairments, but also their health and physical fitness, their biography, their personality, the social and psychological environment in which they live in. All these things go together to create a person and their outlook on them. So people live with dementia rather than being defined by it. There are a number of characteristics that people living with dementia may have, and these are really important to think about when we think about why it might be challenging, why they might be a seldom heard group. And these are by no means all the characteristics and symptoms that may occur, and someone may not have all of them, they may have some of them. But some of the things we may be thinking about, maybe some memory impairments, so remembering events, living in the past, so imagining yourself to be a child, to talk about your parents when you're sort of in your late 80s, difficulty in recognising people and places, difficulty in recognising an object, being disorientated in time and space. And another memory impairment is difficulty taking in new information. We also have communication impairments, so losing the ability to both use or understand language, both written and spoken. Word substituting, so meaning to say one thing and the word coming out as a different word. And echolalia, that is repeating what's said to you. So it's not surprising that it can be quite challenging to include people with dementia in research and evaluations. And this has meant that lots of work on dementia tends to rely on the voice of people who care for people living with dementia, either as a focus of that work, so what is life like for carers of people with dementia, or as a proxy answering on behalf of the person with dementia. We also find that there are examples of where people living with dementia are included in research and evaluations. Inappropriate methods are being used quite often, so self-completion surveys with people with living with dementia quite often this results in low response rates, and we can see that in the adult social care survey where you have a very low response rate, and then when you look at that further, you see that 9 out of 10 are having help. So it's only like 3% of the entire sample of people with dementia are answering the questions themselves without help. And also, you also find a lot of studies where people with dementia, or people who lack capacity to consent, are just excluded completely, so have no voice, no part in the evaluation, no part in the research. However, work over the past 20 years has challenged this, and debates have moved from questions about why people with dementia should be included in the research to how. So nowadays we're thinking about how can we include people who live with dementia in research and evaluations. And actually one of the main points of this presentation today is the quote at the bottom that although it's 20 years old, is still, I think, very relevant and hasn't necessarily been acted upon in research. So in far more cases than commonly accepted, communication with people living with dementia is possible. It's not always easy, and it can be a time-consuming and frustrating process, but it is a process well worth persevering with. The rewards are considerable. And the other main point of today, I think, was to talk through a number of the ASCOT tools that are either have been developed and we're using, or we are currently developing, and talk about how they may be used with people living with dementia. So I'm going to talk about mixed methods in care homes, semi-structured ASCOT interview, mixed methods in the community, ASCOT talking mats, ASCOT easy read, and ASCOT proxy. And some I'll talk about at greater length than others because there's quite a few there. So I imagine that quite a few of you are familiar with the care homes version of ASCOT, and this was really the first attempt by the ASCOT team to look at how we may enable people who struggle and are seldom heard in research, and particularly in a care home setting. As we said, the figures suggest that around 70% of people who live in care homes live with dementia. And so the care homes version of ASCOT uses mixed methods. So it combines a number of different ways of gathering information. So primarily, it has observations of residents' lived experience. Researchers look at what's going on, spend a period of time observing residents and what they're doing. This is supplemented with interviews with residents where possible, interviews with family and friends of residents where possible, and interviews with staff about the residents' lives. And all this evidence from those 4 different methods is combined together by the rater, the researcher, and used to rate an individual resident's social care rated quality of life. And as I said, it's designed for use with people with dementia and people with learning disabilities. And one of its great strengths is everybody can participate, so everybody can take part, as long as they have consent from somebody. But the big question was, but how actively can people participate? So there will be some people who may struggle with structured interview in that early version. So the original resident interview was a structured interview. And if people couldn't participate in that, their voice wasn't directly heard in the overall rating. They were observed, and their lived experience was explored through the observation, and we may have spoken to their relatives and to the staff, but not to them themselves. An experience of using the tools within care home settings made us start to think, actually, what we need to do is do less structured interviews, to not have fixed answer options. And this led, in part, to the development of the ASCOT semi-structured interview. And there's a growing body of work that suggests that qualitative interviews that enable people to answer questions in their own words, and talk about things that interest them, and not be confined by a set of structured questions, is a more appropriate method for people who are living with dementia. And as I said, this reflects our experience spending time in care homes doing observations and talking to people. So in 2013-14, there was a small-scale study to develop the semi-structured interview version of ASCOT. And 60 interviews were carried out in care homes. And we used an interview schedule structured around the ASCOT domains. But rather than having very structured fixed questions, the semi-structured interview schedule used a number of prompts, a number of question prompts to guide the interview rather than being fixed questions. It encouraged participants to talk about quality of life in their own words and to talk about things in the order they wanted to talk about them. And to give you an idea of what that means, so rather than having one of the questions that James showed earlier about food and drink and a number of answer options, it would be more conversational, and here would be some of the prompts that may help guide. So you don't have to talk, you don't have to say them out as they are, they're just there to guide the conversation. So, where do you eat your meals? Tell me what happens at meal times. How would you get a snack outside meal times? They're prompts to try and encourage people to talk in their own words about their experiences of food and drink. And I've just got a little bit of two very short conversations about food and drink with older adults living within care homes, both of whom live with dementia. So, what about food? I haven't got an appetite, so I always have to push my grub down. But it's nicely done. It's good cooks here. And do you get to choose what you have to eat? No, you don't get a choice. It just arrives. So these were 2 adults who live with dementia in care homes, who were both quite able to express how they felt about an aspect of food and drink. Both of whom, from experience, would struggle to tick a box on a structured questionnaire, or even in a structured interview, would probably find it very hard to deal with the answer options. There were some limitations to the development of the tool. So the interviews didn't always cover every domain. So we have 8 ASCOT domains. Sometimes, and actually only about a third of cases did we cover every single domain in the interviews. Some participants in the study didn't didn't recognise that they lived in a care home or received support, which makes it quite difficult to ask any questions about the support you receive if you're not sure you're receiving it, or the care home environment if people are not that aware of living in a care home. And also some participants didn't respond on topic. So they weren't always successful in a very traditional sense as interviews, but every interview I found was valuable to the understanding of lived experience and social care-related quality of life. Even when people didn't talk on topic, you got to understand what they understood about answering questions. And it was almost, you could view it as a very close observation of their lives. And what we decided is the semi-structured interviews worked very well when combined with other approaches. So rather than it being a standalone tool at the moment for engagement, we're going to add it to the mixed methods toolkit, so that when you have observations and interviews with staff, it really helps to have a little bit of the resident's own voice in there as well, and that's what the semi-structured tool enables. It also got us thinking about ways we should approach interviews with people living with dementia. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail, and there's lots of work on this. But flexibility was one of the key things about being flexible in your approach. So sometimes you could have a much more structured interview that went through domains in order and you talk about all the domains. Sometimes it would be as simple as having a conversation about the biscuit someone was eating, and they would tell you how happy they were with the biscuit and how they liked afternoon lunch. So it's much more informal. So having that flexible approach to how you approach the interview. About being able to listen, to not worry about silences. So people living with dementia may take longer to process a question, so allowing that silence and allowing them to talk at their own pace and talk about what they would need to talk about. Timing, and there's quite a well-known characteristic of dementia that it varies throughout the day, and sometimes called sundowning, where quite often people's symptoms become worse later in the day. So think about the time. When's a good time for that person? And it may be the morning, it may be just after lunch, it could be. So it's about understanding when is a good time to talk to that person. And same with location, and that's quite difficult because a lot of the best practice suggests that you should do it in a quiet, secluded place. But also people want to be comfortable as well, so sometimes they're comfortable in a busy lounge. And acceptance, accepting people and the responses they give, whether you agree with them or not. So allowing them to talk about things in the way they feel comfortable and happy to. And so I want to talk about mixed methods in the community very briefly, and James mentioned it, and it's about taking those methods we currently use in care homes and applying them to the community, to people's own homes. And we're doing a small feasibility study about that. And the big question is, can we carry out observations in people's own homes? At the moment, we're very used to standing in communal environments, in care homes with big lounges, where there's lots of people, staff and visitors and other residents. That's very different from standing in someone's own home with just you and a care worker. The other ASCOT tool I'd like to talk about is ASCOT and talking mats, and this is a new project we're working on, myself and Anne-Marie. And talking mats is a visual communication tool developed by the University of Stirling, and you can find out more by going to their website. And talking mats uses 3 sets of communication symbols: topics, options, and a visual scale, in order to support conversation. So not just research, but conversations that people may want to have with people who find it hard to express their views through more traditional means. So this is what a talking mat looks like. So I mentioned you've got a top scale, and the talking mat's top scale is 3 different levels. You choose your own top scale, so normally it's something like happy, not sure, unhappy, or like, not sure, dislike. And then your topic at the bottom is my wider world. Now the options, what you do is you ask the person who's taking part in a talking mats interview to place those pictures, those little symbol pictures, under the scale that they most feel it fits. So you might have an option on, do you like or dislike health services? And the person doing this talking mat has put it under like, and hopefully that would stimulate some conversation. And at the end, what you have is a pictorial representation of where they've put the different symbols. And hopefully that's enabled some conversation to go alongside it, so you can see how they view the world and their experiences. So as I said, it's a small project to develop and test a set of cards that are based around the ASCOT domains of social care, quality of life. And there are two phases, developing a set of symbols and testing. And again, we're thinking about putting this as part of a mixed methods approach, because what comes out of this is not 4 levels of ASCOT. It's a like and a dislike and a conversation. So it needs to be interpreted as some kind of rating process. So at the moment, that fits very much within the mixed methods approach. ASCOT EasyRead, which James has just talked about, and yeah, it was designed for and tested with people with intellectual and learning disabilities, but it does have the potential to be used with people living with dementia. And lots of organisations have produced easy read material with visual cues to help people understand and more simple language. And CQC, Cornwall County Council, Thurrock Council have all used this approach to communicate with people living with dementia. So this has a potential, although we haven't tested it at the moment. And the last tool I want to talk about is the ASCOT proxy tool. And so James mentioned this briefly earlier. So it's a tool designed for enabling either the informal or the formal carer to answer social care related quality of life questions on behalf of the person they look after. And what we know from research is that proxy views are not the same as the views of the person in care. There is a difference. So you can't just substitute one for the other and say it's the same. What you're getting is something different. You're getting a proxy view. And if you think about the tool itself, there is a tension. Its aim is to give people a voice, but there is a tension between giving people a voice and taking it away. So if the proxy tool is overused, used in circumstances where there are methods where people could talk themselves, or be enabled to talk themselves or communicate themselves, it can take that voice away. But it can be used as a last resort where people cannot communicate. And so that's being developed currently. And as long as it's used sparingly and with good judgment, it can help us understand people's lives. But it does have that potential and intention to take voices away if used incorrectly. So there's just a really quick overview of ASCOT tools and how they may be used to understand people's lives who live with dementia. And obviously we're doing more work all the time. But the main points are, as I said, people living with dementia can have a voice in evaluations and research, and the right approach and the right tools can enable this. And we think there are increasingly a range of ASCOT tools which can help you do this, that aim to enable people living with research to participate in the research and actually participate directly rather than just via the voice of someone else. So, thanks very much for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
If you have questions, raise your hand now. No? No questions? Then. Oh, no, 2 hands have just gone up. So, firstly, if I unmute Claire, Claire, you should now be able to speak and we should be able to hear you. Hello, Claire. Ah, right, okay, I can see that you sent it in via the question thing. Do you have to go on the course to get the tools, or can you download them?
Shall I answer that? Or?
Because I'll say, no, you can download them. If you're talking about the tools as a whole, yes, you can download them. For the care homes version of ASCOT, you are free to download and just use it. But because of the complexity of it, and particularly because you gather information and you as the researcher, you as the evaluator, make the rating yourselves, we advise coming on the course and learning how to make that rating and how to collect all that evidence. So we would advise if you want to use CH3 to come on the course, which is being held in a few weeks. It's not mandatory.
And a follow-up question to that, when is there a course for care homes?
8th and 9th of June in Kent.
Okay. Claire, I hope that answered your questions. Now come to Francis. Just going to unmute you now. If you'd like to ask a question. Okay, I can see Francis has sent the question in. Have people with blindness, stroke deafness, stroke dual sensory impairments been able to use the ASCOT surveys?
We have a Braille version of ASCOT, which we can share, and give to people. I think we haven't really investigated sensory impairments as much as we could have done. Hopefully, if we get more funding, it's something we will do. But as I said, we do have a Braille version of ASCOT.
And if people want that,
contact us and we can supply that.
Does anyone else like to add to that? Is there anything else going on that? No. No. So that's on our list of things that we haven't got around to doing yet. But it's a really good point. I think it's something that, and we've also recently been talking about looking at other minority groups such as LGBT and the fact that they're possibly experiencing different outcomes in social care, and that's something that we should be looking at as well. But obviously, all of these things require funding, so it's a really interesting point to raise. It's something that we do think is important.
any other questions? Either send them in or raise your virtual hand now. No? Okay, well, thank you all for attending. Just from a technical point of view, we welcome any feedback on how people think this has worked as a means of having the presentations. I will put the recording of this online later today, and also the